Well, anyone who tells you that the liver removes oxalate from the body has not spent 20 minutes even reading medical literature. They know zero because the liver makes oxalate. The liver does not remove oxalate from the body.
Hey guys, today we have Sally K Norton back to the show again. Sally is a world expert on the subject of oxalates. It is because of people like Sally K Norton that serious issues like oxalate toxicity are being exposed to the general public. I'm very happy to invite Sally K Norton to the show again. Thanks, Sally, for coming to the show.
It's great to be with you again.
Thanks, Sally. Sally, before we go into the questions, can you say where can people connect with you?
Yes, I have a website that is sallyknorton.com. It's Sally Knorton.com. And I'm also on Instagram at sknorton. At Instagram. Those are the two best places to reach me.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, my first question is that many people go on a keto diet, but they experience kidney problems. I think it is because they are eating too much oxalate foods. What do you say about that?
I have a lot of clients who use the keto diet because they're struggling so hard with their weight and their diabetes. And we're taught to eat almonds as bread and turn almond meal or flour into muffins that you could do quickly in a microwave. And they're starting eating more and more almonds and to do smoothies with almond paste and almond milk and then add spinach to that. They're taught to do spinach salads. They're told that dark cacao, very dark, fancy chocolates and bitter chocolate is good for them. And so they start adding more dark chocolate for treats to make up for the less sugar in their diet and more spinach and almonds. And those are probably the three worst foods you could do in terms of adding oxalate to your diet. Very bioavailable. That means it can get into your bloodstream very easily and start overloading your body with oxalate. And that's what I have discovered for myself is that without even doing keto, but just wanting to eat those foods that we are told are good for us can lead into this overload in the body. So yes, keto diets, there's no question that people who think they need an almond bread, they need a smoothie, or they need dark chocolate and they're doing keto, then they can get you in big trouble with oxalate overload, which is a known uremic or urinary toxin that destroys your kidneys and ends up potentially for some people causing kidney stones, but not for everyone. But, you know, there are other foods that can keep you on a low carb diet that aren't almonds, spinach, and chocolate. Unfortunately, that's how keto's been translated to keep it kind of popular so people don't miss their bread and miss their sweets. And it's just a way of kind of babying people and not being willing to tell them, you know what, we kind of need to eat meat to be keto. In order to stay low carb, the low carb foods in nature are the animal foods and the carb foods in nature are the plant foods. And so there's just a few plant foods that are low enough in carbs to fit a keto diet, which is very low oxalate, a very low carb diet. Keto is about 20 grams of carbs a day or less, which is extremely low compared to how most people are eating 200 to 400 grams of carbs a day.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, many people think that our liver can break down oxalates and clear out no matter the amount. So what do you say about that?
Well, anyone who tells you that the liver removes oxalate from the body has not spent 20 minutes even reading medical literature. They know zero because the liver makes oxalate. The liver does not remove oxalate from the body. Yes, the liver is the great organ of detox and it combines molecules with certain fat-soluble toxins to help your body clean. The liver does so many important things for us. But in fact, the liver is basically sturdy organ that can tolerate a fair amount of oxalate exposure, which is a wonderful thing because it makes oxalate as it breaks down hydroxyproline and some other amino acids, and there are other compounds that are bad for us like something called ethylene glycol, which is in antifreeze and solar panels. It's a heat transfer chemical that when the liver metabolizes it, it turns it into oxalate. And so we can talk about that too, about why that's important and how that it helps us to learn about oxalate and its effects on us. But the thing is, the liver does not remove oxalate, but the liver takes a hit every time you eat that keto bread or the spinach smoothie or the chocolate. You absorb it from your intestines and stomach too. The absorption of oxalate starts in the stomach and in the small intestine, and even maybe further down in the large intestine. And everything that comes into your body from your digestive tract goes straight to the liver. So every bit of oxalate you absorb from your keto foods goes straight to the liver. And the liver protects itself beautifully and has to use glutathione to protect itself from the damaging effects of the oxalate, and usually protects itself pretty well. However, that might deplete the liver of glutathione over time and reduce your ability to detox other chemicals. And so if you're also being exposed to formaldehyde and other compounds that are hurting your body that your liver has to cope with, if it's also coping with a high load of keto bread and oxalate coming from your diet, then there may not be enough glutathione to go around, and you might end up developing a multiple chemical sensitivity because your body is not clearing those other toxins as well as it should, because the oxalate is using up so much glutathione. So anyone who tells you that the liver is protecting you from oxalate has never read anything about the true physiology of oxalate. They're completely ill-informed, have not bothered to study, and are daring to have opinions without any real knowledge. You should close down your ears to people who say things like that. Stop listening to their ill-informed approach to teaching you about, I don't know what they think they're doing for you by spouting opinions without looking for actual data. That's sad.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, can you talk about trigger and maintenance theory?
Okay, so this is the heart of the matter. We're getting to the heart of the matter. So the thing with oxalate is, yes, you eat it. And when you eat it, you are disturbing your digestive tract and harming your digestive tract. The number one symptom of oxalate problems is actually digestive problems. It's more common than kidney problems, which is a great surprise to people. And then you've got your liver exposure, and then it's getting into your bloodstream, right? It gets from your gut to your blood to your liver, and from the liver, it travels a little bit up into the heart, and then into your lungs, and then back into your heart, and then through your whole body. So the oxalate that you eat is affecting all those organs right away, including your whole vascular system. And the vascular system and the gut are smart. They're covered in epithelial cells. These cells are brilliant. They can do so many things. They have many powers, and one of them is to read the chemical environment and to detect what's going on. And they can detect when oxalate is high, when toxins are high, and they have to call in the troops and have a response. So trigger and maintenance is a beautiful theory that started in the 1960s that was looking at kidney issues and was confirmed in the when did she do that study? It was in the 2000s, actually. It's a fairly recent study with a rat study that demonstrated that just kind of normal-ish levels of oxalate coming into the body from the diet cause a retention of 4% of what gets absorbed into the tissues. So not only is it getting into the liver and the heart and the blood, as it's doing that, some traces of that get left behind in the body before the kidneys can remove it from the blood. So what trigger and maintenance tells us is that you only need maybe about 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces of chocolate to deliver a trigger dose. So the trigger dose is a high spike in oxalate in the blood that creates deposits in the body. Okay, so when you see these peaks coming in after a meal, it creates a new deposit. Now, the maintenance is when you say just eat 1 chocolate chip cookie with a couple of chips in there, so a tiny bit of chocolate or a little bit of spinach in a salad that has other greens, or just a couple of nuts or a little bit of potato, smaller amounts of oxalate maintain those deposits. So until you get really low in oxalate for 5 days or so and stop eating oxalate, the trigger doses that started the deposits stay in your body. And as long as you're eating a little bit of oxalate here and there, they stay there. That's the maintenance side. And what happens with trigger and maintenance is we can work with that to help the body remove oxalate, but the body will stay in maintenance mode as long as we keep a little bit of oxalate in our diet. So an only way you can get oxalate deposits is if you eat trigger doses, which everyone does because we eat these foods so routinely as normal all over the world now. I mean, even peanuts, which weren't even human food until 100 years ago or 150 years ago, were just from the American South. And then it became this economic development project, and we turned it into human food, and now they're eating it all over the world, right? So potatoes also spread from the New World and now are eaten everywhere. And so just with potatoes and peanuts, most of us are eating enough oxalate to have trigger doses and maintenance doses. So we tend to be accumulating oxalate, but this is not well known in science. So everyone is to be forgiven for not recognizing this. Even though we have the science that lays it out, it hasn't really been put together and tested and retested and retested in the laboratory. There hasn't been reasons to fund that, and that's a whole different discussion. But trigger and maintenance tells us that if we don't go super low in oxalate and stay there, then we're going to have deposits in our body.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, many doctors and nutritionists are unable to open their mind regarding oxalates. What do you say to them?
Well, I was the same way. You know, I have a degree in nutrition and public health and have been in the sphere of holistic and traditional medicine and traditional healing methods, something we call integrative medicine. And I thought I knew a lot. And I have a lot of colleagues and friends who are in healthcare. And I studied at one of the greatest, institutions in the US for nutrition. And so I thought I knew stuff. And when I was first getting clues that I should be paying attention to oxalate for my own health, I was sort of confused and I was very skeptical about that. And that's because I still had this remnant of belief that what was in my textbooks and what I was taught in school was probably mostly right, even though I had to unlearn a lot of what I learned at Cornell. Like, for example, one of my professors at Cornell told us flat out that sugar is benign, except for dental caries. So basically he told us nutrition students that we can have all the sugar we want as long as we brush our teeth. And maybe that has something to do, that attitude has something to do with why we have diabetes exploding all over the world, with India being the worst country and the worst continent in the world with diabetes. Perhaps that's coming from the experts who gave us so much permission to eat carbs because they're low in fat. I mean, there's only two ways to get energy, really. There's carbs and there's fat. And we were told, especially heavily in the 1980s and 90s, that fat is going to kill you. And that came from academia. When I left Cornell, I was under the impression that fat caused heart disease, cancer, and every single other health problem came from fat. That's what I believed. And I also believed that vitamins were dangerous and sugar was okay and lots of things that aren't true. But even though I learned they weren't true, and I walked away with the idea that vegetarianism is very good for us, and I was one. I was a vegetarian for 8 years and then a vegan for 8 more years. And that was a terrible mistake for my health. But still, I had stopped being a vegetarian for at least 15 years when I started learning about oxalates and started to see that I should look into this some more and give it a try for my own health. But I didn't understand it because I didn't have good information. I went back and looked at my textbooks, and each of my textbooks had a little tiny piece of text that was about 5 sentences long about oxalate. They really don't cover it. So my textbook professors, the people who write textbooks, don't cover it. My professors don't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about it. So therefore, we have to assume that since my textbook writers and my professors didn't cover it, it doesn't matter. So everybody's under that impression that it doesn't matter, thinking that we know everything there is to know, and yet the world is exploding in childhood illnesses, early childhood cancers, an explosion of childhood kidney stones and kidney stones in women, obesity, just so many serious behavioral and health problems that are chronic, autoimmune explosion. Now we have trouble resisting a virus worldwide, and we think we know everything. Well, honestly, we don't. And we've been misinformed so much that it's blocking objective frame of mind. And I can tell you that my professors at Cornell were not particularly objective scientific people. One of my professors is famous for having written a book called The China Study. And when I was in school, he would complain to us about how no one wanted to fund his data analysis, and he was having trouble pulling together his data analysis. Well, later on, he's been censured for lack of academic integrity, because what was really driving his work on the China study was an ideological point of view that we shouldn't be eating meat and animal products. And he was setting out to prove that humans shouldn't eat meat and animal products and milk and dairy. And he used the Chinese to try to do that. Unfortunately, the Chinese are not vegetarians. But somehow he convinced the world that the Chinese diet proves that vegetarianism is appropriate, because you can pretty much do anything when you're in authority and you know how to work with statistics. You can make a case for anything. And that's a very concerning idea, that the people we're trusting to be scientific and objective are human beings as well. I think to get over this, we need to acknowledge that we have a lot to learn, and we should all humble ourselves in the face of the suffering that's going on the planet, and being willing to keep learning.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, many health experts advise that if we take enough calcium, then oxalates do not have effect over us. What do you say about that?
Well, calcium is certainly important, and the loss of dairy from the diet that's been going on these last 10 to 20 years, and it's really been longer than that, really since we got thinking that you can drink soda pop and high C and fake fruit juice and even fruit juice instead of milk, is lowered the amount of calcium that we're eating, and has increased our vulnerability to oxalate, because calcium is an important part of your metabolism. It's an incredibly necessary nutrient that we need a lot of. And unfortunately, when you eat high oxalate, you lose a lot of calcium in the diet, because oxalate grabs the calcium and you can't absorb it. So it's very true that you need calcium to protect yourself from oxalate, but it doesn't mean that you can have all the oxalate you want, because no amount of calcium will prevent the absorption of oxalate. Some amount of the oxalate stays in this ionic form that gets absorbed anyway. So yes, more calcium is somewhat protective in a moderate oxalate diet. Unfortunately, most people don't eat a moderate oxalate diet. They eat a high oxalate diet. And calcium, with calcium, you might, let's say theoretically, with a kind of low calcium diet, you're absorbing 15 or 20% of the oxalate that you eat. Add a lot of calcium, now you're going to absorb only 8 or 10%. But if you're eating 100 times the amount of oxalate your body can handle, you're just reducing it to like 8 times the amount of your body can handle. You're still eating 8 times too much oxalate from what your body can handle, even with calcium supplements and a lot of dairy in the diet. So yeah, calcium matters a whole lot, but it's not a magic thing that suddenly puts up a super shield that protects you from oxalate's damage.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, some people claim that meat eaters are affected by oxalates more than vegetarians. What do you say about that?
That's fantasy, made up stuff. It's not, there's nothing in the literature that would suggest that. There are some studies that show that high protein actually protects kidneys, that high protein protects us from aging. There are some sort of veggie oriented studies out there, and there's a lot of studies who suffer from the kind of Colin Campbell problem where the researcher is so set on their point of view that they make sure that their conclusions match what they already believed, even when their data doesn't match what they believe. So one thing that could be quite enlightening, if you go back and really read nutrition articles and you look at their methodology and then you look at how they're describing what they're doing and what their conclusions are, it doesn't match. Like their actual methodology and their way of describing what they're doing isn't a good match. And then their conclusions isn't a good match for even their own data. And somehow they get away with publishing that anyway.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, some believe that only metabolically unhealthy people are affected by oxalates, but not healthy people. What do you say about that?
Well, I'd like to know who's measuring metabolic health in every human on the planet, because given the high carbohydrate, high refined foods with low nutrient levels, a huge majority of people are metabolically unhealthy. We know this because 2/3 to 3/4 of the population are overweight. So being overweight is a sign of metabolic ill health. So yeah, a lot of people are metabolically unhealthy. Can the super healthy people tolerate more oxalate? Probably so, because when you're obese, you absorb more oxalate because you have a leaky gut. Basically, obesity leads to low gut function, which allows a lot more oxalate to be absorbed. So instead of absorbing the standard 10 to 15%, you might be absorbing 30 to 60%, which would get you in bigger trouble faster with oxalates because you're obese or you're metabolically unwell. Does that mean that the few people that are super healthy can eat more oxalate? Yeah, they probably can. Does that mean that they're not being damaged by it? No.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, I like your sandpaper analogy. Can you talk about that?
The sandpaper analogy. So there is multiple forms of oxalate in foods. There's the soluble kind, which dissolves into little salts, and so they become ions. But then there's these calcium oxalate crystals that plants make. And calcium oxalate crystals come in lots of shapes, like those toothpicks, the raphides that we've talked about in the past. They also come in this crystal sand, literally little tiny square blocks, and a whole bunch of other shapes. So when you're eating these are like little bits of quartz dust. They're very fine and little, but it's fine sandpaper. You're literally eating sandpaper that has an electromagnetic charge to it. Both the ions and the sandy grit in the foods cause electromagnetic damage to cell membranes. And it scrambles the orientation and the position of the various molecules in membranes, especially the types of fats that are supposed to be on the inside of the membrane instead of on the outside of the membrane. So that's kind of like turning a house and taking your inside wallboard and putting it on the outside and bringing in your brick and clapboards to the inside, and then the house is backwards. It doesn't function to keep the weather out very well as the rain melts the wallboard, right? The materials that are re-scrambled in these membranes really messes up the cells and they die. And you don't notice that because you got trillions of cells. So if you kill off a few hundred with each meal, who cares? Because you got trillions. But in the long run, this is a big problem, especially if the membranes involved are the mitochondria. Because when the mitochondria membranes start leaking, they leak the protons that they're supposed to be pumping. So mitochondria create electromagnetic charges, as do all membrane structures. They have a certain amount of positive charge on one side and negative on the other. And how the mitochondria create energy is they move these hydrogen ions on one side of a membrane. Hydrogen ion is a tiny little molecule. If the membrane stops working well, that hydrogen leaks. And so the whole point of what the mitochondria does as a proton pump fails. And then you can't produce your energy for your cell. And that creates oxidative stress and brings on the immune system and causes the cell to die.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, what is your opinion on mixed diets?
Mixed diets. That's like the word balanced. Oh, eat a balanced diet. What is a mixed diet anyway? That's just meaningless fluff. So give me something really solid to hang on to, like Is it got a lot of fiber, low fiber? I think what they mean is you should be able to eat whatever you want and not worry about it. And yeah, okay, we'd love that to be the case, but we were letting people eat whatever they want, and we've got a very unhealthy population. So we need to get a little more sophisticated than using these vague terms that sound professional that are really just not meaningful.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, many people these days are taking too much vitamin C. What do you say about that?
Yeah, isn't that sad that vitamin C is not necessarily good for us in high doses? The research suggests that people who take a lot of vitamin C and vitamin E, by the way, live shorter lives. So even without the oxalate issue, which we'll get to in a minute, if you take a lot of antioxidants all the time, you interrupt the cell's ability to communicate with each other and itself. So cells naturally in the mitochondria put out these little free radicals as part of communication. And they need little bits of free radicals in order to function. If you keep squelching all the free radicals all the time, you're interrupting this, what we call redox balance in cells. And then you slow down the cell's ability to generate its own defenses, generate enough glutathione and all this stuff. And you're actually working against what you're trying to achieve, which is low inflammation in the body. You actually interfere with the body's ability to control and regulate inflammation by overly squelching these signaling or communication molecules. So all by itself, just taking vitamins, we know in the long run, that's not good. Now, when you're really sick and dying of sepsis, you might need a big dose of vitamin C. But if you're not dying of sepsis and not being supervised by the doctor in the ER, you need to be more aware that how much vitamin C is helpful. And then when you're just wasting vitamin C, which degenerates just sitting around in a capsule or in a glass of water or juice, vitamin C degenerates into, guess what? Oxalic acid. So it just naturally does that. You don't even need enzymes. Like, unlike we talked about the ethylene glycol, it's the enzymes in the liver that turn that into oxalate in the body. But vitamin C naturally degrades into oxalate, which might be why many plants, when they make oxalate, they make vitamin C first, and then it's very easy to convert it into oxalate because it's a natural degradation product in biology. Even stuff in the sky can turn into oxalate. That we have oxalate raining down in polluted cities. So major polluted cities, especially in China, are full of oxalate in the air because chemicals degrade into oxalate, and vitamin C is one of those. So you can maybe use up to like 400 milligrams of oxalate to saturate all your immune cells in the diet, right? So you eat like maybe 400 and you saturate and you max out what you can use. After that, it's all just extra. And that extra degrades because it's not being used metabolically. It's just hanging around, degrading into oxalate. So we know that people who take a lot of vitamin C are prone to excreting high levels of oxalate and developing kidney stones. It's very important to take appropriate amounts of vitamin C. If you eat fresh foods, you're probably getting a fair amount of vitamin C from fresh foods and don't need much supplementation. If you're eating just meat with some rice and things, you may need a little bit. And if you know you're under a lot of oxidative stress, you may need a little bit. And I recommend people take maybe 100 milligrams of vitamin C split into 2 doses, so your body can really use it appropriately. We need vitamin C, but people are eating vitamin C at 5 grams, 10 grams, 15 and more. And that's quite toxic. And they're not told that.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you for educating us. Sally, some people claim that oxalates are beneficial to our body. What do you say to them?
Well, we've been trying to make them beneficial somehow. And, we see a little bit of free radical stress is a way that the body takes, like exercise creates free radicals, and that's good for us, right? So a little bit of what's bad for us can be good for us. That's called hormesis. So we like to think we need hormetic effects from these plant toxins. But the truth is your body's going to make some oxalate anyway. So at least 45%, probably 40 to 50% of the oxalate that you have to excrete every day and get rid of is coming from your own metabolism. So you've already got oxalate on board. So whatever amount you might need, which there's zero evidence that we need this. This is a uremic toxin. This is something that causes trouble. We don't have a strong evidence that it's good for human beings. It's great for plants, right? They need it and use it, and it works great for them. But for animals and humans especially, it's not good for us. And we make some anyway. So there's absolutely no reason to eat oxalate.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, how oxalates interferes with our immune system?
Oh boy, this is a big topic and really gets to the heart of things that, and just to get to the conclusion before I explain how we get there, if you've got a situation of immune problems, you feel like you're developing autoimmune problems and or fibrotic diseases. So a good example of a fibrotic immune disorder would be endometriosis in women. Okay. That is the kind of thing that oxalate leads to. Okay, so remember I mentioned about the membrane damage that oxalate ions and crystals can cause because of electromagnetic charges. That causes cells to leak out things. And when you see leakage products from cells, which includes potassium and bits of other things from the cell, the immune system is got patrolling cells running around looking for those kinds of problems. And when they detect those leakage products, they put out cytokines, or they react to that and say, oh, they basically go pull the alarm bells that ask the fire department and the police to come, right? So they're calling out their troopers, their first responders, to come deal with this cell damage, because they're assuming that something's attacking these cells. They're detecting cell damage products, and they're bringing in the immune system to deal with it. And if it's just a little bit after a meal, your immune system will clean up those cells you just killed with the oxalate and move on. The problem is that 4% retention. So what you have left behind now are crystals building up in your thyroid gland, in your bones, in your teeth, in your sinuses, wherever they happen to get hung up. And that can be very different for each person where the deposits tend to land. But if you've got little particles building up in your tissues, that is a problem for the immune system, because those particles aren't supposed to be there, and the immune system's job is to get rid of junk that shouldn't be in the body. And at some point, the immune system will try to get rid of that, which can cause like a gout attack. And then if the body's immune system is really working well, it'll try for a little while, a week or two, to get rid of the crystal in your toe or your fingers. And then it'll realize, you know what, this isn't working. This is a very difficult particle to remove. So we'll just stop this here. And it'll contain the crystal, and it'll wrap it up in dead DNA or dead immune cells and create an insulation and let the crystal sit there. But later on, especially if you're like me and you've reduced the oxalate in your diet, the crystal's still there. And eventually the immune system has to go back and remove it. And that can create a lot of symptoms. And so back into the gout, back into the arthritis, back into the back pain, back into the generalized inflammation that can cause migraines and a whole host of problems, because you're turning on the immune system to get rid of the crystals. So you get short-term immune problems as the oxalate comes into the body, but then you can get these periodic waves of oxalate turning on the immune system in order to try to get rid of these hard to remove particles. In the medical literature, we equate oxalate to asbestos. Okay, so you have the same disease when you have oxalate building up in your body, which is called oxalosis, as you do when you have asbestosis or silicosis. When you have little molecules building up in your body, that can create long-term autoimmune type illness and fibrosis. And fibrotic disease and autoimmune and immune systems that are out of control and confused are very common causes of death. Okay, fibrosis and immune system out of control. And oxalate can be the reason for that for some people.
Thank you so much, Sally. Sally, what do you think about juice cleansing or detox drinks?
Wow. Well, we have this idea that the body needs us to stop eating nutrients and eat liquefied plants so that it can detox, because I'm not sure why we think this, because the body is designed for constant renewal and self-care and removal of bad things. That's why we have liver. That's why we have a kidney. That's why we have skin and pores and why we have an immune system. The body's designed to be continually managing and detoxing. And we think we know better than the body. And we've got this commercially viable idea that if we juice vegetables, we're detoxing. But probably we need to understand more about how the body works and rethink that, because it really is an unproven idea that I think is getting people in trouble with their health. And I certainly have a lot of clients who tried juicing who have been damaged by it.
Sally, especially like if we take juice of spinach or something, the oxalates will get more bioavailable, right?
Yes, right. That's exactly right. That when you liquefy, you liberate and help dissolve the oxalate so that it's easily absorbed. The more water present in the meal, the more that solution of bioavailable dissolved oxalate makes it very easy for it to float in, because the way that oxalate gets in the body is it floats in with the water that slides between the cells. So there's this, what we call paracellular transit. The cells are hooked together by basically like Velcro hooks. Okay, out in the membranes of cells, there's these proteins that hook together like Velcro. But if you think about it, there's a lot of space between the hooks. And the oxalate in water, the oxalate is dissolved in that water and moves between the hooks. If you have obesity, the hooks don't hook together very well. And that's why you get a lot more oxalate coming in the body, because it's just floating in the water. So juicing gives you more water, more dissolved oxalates, more bioavailable, because it can float between the cells so easily.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, some people claim that if we drink enough water, that's enough to clear out oxalates. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of frustrated clients whose doctors keep telling them they have kidney stones and they have bladder problems because they don't drink enough water. These poor people are drinking so much water, it's almost dangerous. And they're like, that doesn't work. They know from their own experience that that doesn't work. And that's interesting because it comes from the idea of supersaturation of urine, that the more concentrated the urine is, the more toxic it is, and the more that crystals form in the urine and become kidney stones. And there's a lot of problems with that, again, because you're treating the body like a petri dish or like a Bunsen burner or something physical, rather than an intelligent being who's constantly responding to its environment, who's constantly generating compounds and managing pH and doing all these things to keep conditions appropriate to avoid problems like crystals in the urine. And so it's not a very helpful idea, the supersaturation of urine and drinking a lot of water. What makes a difference about whether you get kidney stones or not is pH, which is why we like citrates and acids that turn into help the body create a more alkaline urine, actually. And the body's ability to produce these proteins that prevent crystals from clumping and becoming stones. Some of that's genetic, and some of that has to do with how much you've wrecked your kidneys with drugs and too much oxalate. So water, of course, is necessary, but it's not an answer to overeating oxalate.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, what's the connection between thyroid and oxalates?
Yeah, so fascinating, because most of us have oxalate crystals in our thyroid gland. The older you are, the better the chance of that. And that's because you've had more years of eating peanut butter and potatoes and turmeric or whatever to build it up, because it's exposure over time leads to this crystal deposits, 4% every day left behind. The more years you have, the more of it you have in your thyroid gland. And for some reason, glands are very prone to picking up oxalate. And there's different theories about why that might be. One of them is because glands make a lot of products, so they have to bring in a lot of raw materials. So they tend to sweep in a lot of whatever is in the extracellular fluid, and oxalate gets squeezed into the extracellular fluid from our bloodstream because the capillary beds are so tight. They're designed to kind of push out the plasma fluid into the tissues. And some of those tissues have more affinity for oxalate getting stuck. and it doesn't go back into the other end of the capillary where it goes on to become a vein. And the thyroid gland is clearly one of those tissues. The thyroid gland has a transporter on it that moves iodine, and that same transporter also moves oxalate. So it could be that as the thyroid gland is trying to get iodine, it's actually pulling in oxalate by mistake too.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, many people still think that boiling the food will eliminate or cooking the food will eliminate oxalates. Can you once again talk about that?
Yes, so heat does not destroy oxalate. Oxalate's pretty durable to heat. But the soluble oxalate can dissolve in water like it does in the juice, So you can pull out some oxalate by boiling it long time in water. By the time it's boiled enough, it's pretty soft. Like broccoli, you can cut back the oxalate by a third or even a half if you boil it and throw out the water. But you need to boil it 7 to 12 minutes, and that's pretty mushy broccoli. But it's still worth doing it. If you like broccoli, it is worth boiling it instead of sautéing it or baking it or, however else. Even steaming it is not really that great. But boiling it, you can remove some of the oxalate and make some medium oxalate foods lower in oxalate. But a lot of foods that have a high oxalate are so high in oxalate, even if you remove half the oxalate, which mostly boiling doesn't tend to remove half. It's more like 20 to 30%. It's not going to remove enough of it to turn it into a low oxalate food. But of course, anything you can do to cut down the oxalate is a good idea. But you're wiser to learn which foods are really high and which ones aren't so high, and skew your selection away from those high oxalate foods first, rather than thinking that cooking, because cooking does degenerate proteins like lectins, and soaking will degenerate phytates, but that's not the case with oxalate.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, now we have questions from subscribers. First question is, does soaking almonds remove oxalates?
So almonds are nuts, and many nuts are all nuts are seeds, and many seeds and plants use oxalate, calcium oxalate, in order to store calcium. And the calcium is an enzyme cofactor for germination and is needed for germination. So when you soak nuts, you're trying to turn on the germination process, get that started. And when you do that, you turn the calcium oxalate crystals into more soluble oxalate. So what you do is you switch the insoluble crystals, which are not absorbed, into soluble oxalate, which are easily absorbed. So by soaking nuts and seeds and almonds, you may be increasing the bioavailability of the oxalate. You don't reduce the amount of oxalate. You just actually make it easier to get it into your liver and bloodstream.
Thank you, Sally. Next question is, how to know how much of oxalates are there in our body?
It would be nice if there was a way to do that. There is not. The oxalates are so tiny, they can't be detected on MRI or CT scan or any other imaging technique. It's even hard to judge based on tissue biopsy. So if you wanted someone to drill a hole in your hip and take out a little bit of bone, which your doctor is smart enough to not do to you, but this is the gold standard for measuring oxalate levels in the body, is taking a biopsy of the hip bone. And if you happen to be a person whose oxalate is landing in your hip bone, they might be able to see it there, but they have to use good technique and be very quick, because the crystals, especially in the thyroid crystals, when they look at tissues, thyroid tissue, they find that those crystals start disappearing in 2.5 hours after the biopsy. So that's a very short period of time. Usually the nurses and the lab assistants around the operating room aren't running your tissue biopsy straight to the lab and getting it analyzed in the next 2 hours. Sometimes it sits in a refrigerator for a whole weekend before they even look at it. So it's very easy to overlook crystals that might have been in a tissue. And then in the fancy studies that isn't clinical, but research studies, they use fancier microscopes, these electron microscopes that can see things smaller. The electron beam destroys an oxalate crystal in 2.5 minutes. So by the time you've found an area to focus on and you focus and you're looking at it, you've spent your 2 minutes and now your beam is destroying the crystal you wanted to find. So we don't have a good way, even in fancy research, to really find, detect, and then quantify. That's really practically impossible to do.
Sally, but can we see microcrystals?
Microcrystals are the size that you can see under the light microscope, and the nanocrystals are the ones nobody can see unless you really have specialized researcher. And I have a feeling a huge number of crystals in the body spend a lot of time being nanocrystals that are completely invisible. And then these microcrystals, have various situations in the body. Some of them are tied down in something called the net, which is that dead DNA. Some of them are in the middle of a granuloma, which is an immune system sort of thing that can become a problem. And sometimes you can find those crystals in the granulomas or different deposits, but they're basically really easy to overlook, which is why we don't know about this accumulation problem, because they're sneaky, like little ghosts almost. I mean, oxalate does a lot of sneaky things. It causes systemic changes in the body that lead to other problems that take a few steps of body reactions and body coping that create problems where you don't see who caused it in the beginning. So not only are those systemic problems hard to follow back, but even the crystals themselves can be hard to detect.
Thank you, Sally. But how did you discover about the oxalates?
For myself, or what got me interested? Yeah, I had a lot of health problems. I've been working in academia. I worked for the program on integrative medicine at a university in North Carolina. And then I worked at the university here in Virginia, writing research grants. And I had to quit that job. I was struggling mightily with back pain and fatigue and bleeding and needed a hysterectomy and did not recover well from that and could no longer work. After that surgery, I was unable to work. I had lost the ability to read and was disabled. And I was researching what was wrong with me, found out I had a sleep problem. My brain was waking up 29 times an hour. And it was incredible. I couldn't exercise. I couldn't read. I couldn't function. And I'm just fighting for an answer. Now, I had had health problems and pain problems since I was about 12. So at one point, I had this situation where I was getting pain in the crotch area, and my husband looked that up online and found the Vulva Pain Foundation, which has been teaching the low oxalate diet for 26 years now. And that is led by a non-scientist. But I was desperate. So I joined them and read their materials and tried to understand what they were teaching me. And I was a little slow to learn from them, even though she's describing exactly what I had. She said people who need to be avoiding oxalate have connective tissue disorders. Well, I had all those things she described: weak skin, slow healing, back pain, arthritis, fatigue. And I didn't get it because my education from my fine professors and textbook writers had me thinking that I knew what I was thinking, but I didn't understand how to think about oxalate. So in order to satisfy my mind, I need science and I need facts. I am not taking someone else, even if they've done work for 26 years, that's not good enough for me. I had to go back and find the actual research. And so I've spent 6 years in the medical literature reading every day about this topic and trying to figure this out. I started teaching in my community when I first figured out that oxalate was why I had the sleep problem. Oxalate was why I had years of foot problems that put me in wheelchairs and interrupted my education. Oxalate's why I had severe back problems. Oxalate's why I had all this arthritis while I was vegan, and why I was having neurological problems and trouble with fatigue and trouble with energy and trouble with low blood sugar and probably my low blood pressure and all these things. It turns out that what I thought was many different problems was a problem of being poisoned by my Swiss chard and sweet potatoes that I loved so much. And boy, was that quite upsetting. Like, wait a minute, I've been gardening these organic vegetables since I was 9, being a tissues, eating well. It's been harming me this whole time. And none of my friends in medicine and in integrative medicine and holistic healing could tell me that. Nobody knew to tell me and warn me. And I thought, well, there's got to be other people out there who like Swiss chard and sweet potatoes, who like spinach, who are eating nuts. Like, I'm not the only one. There's got to be other people. So I started teaching in my community, and lo and behold, people with bladder problems, people with nighttime arousals, people with really serious illnesses started hearing what I was saying and describing to them, and they took the hard leap and thought, you know what, I got to change my thinking about what I eat. And they actually did it, and they actually got better. And so I started doing consulting with people, and now I've been working on this full time, as much as a person who is damaged by this toxicity illness can do. And it's remarkable what I've been learning, because I've been willing to let the real world help us understand what may or may not be right about what's being written in the medical literature. Because the medical literature has the same problems as our textbook writers and our professors, where we repeat things that we think were true once that have been since misproven, but we keep repeating the wrong one. And so we keep getting in our own way of moving the progress forward. So moving that needle forward in terms of learning has been quite slow. And partly because research is so divorced from the real world. If we were studying more people like me and my followers, we could be learning much quicker. But we have this resistance. We don't want to change what we eat. We want to come up with workarounds. If we just have more of this or more of that, then we can do what we want. We don't have to change our favorite food or our favorite behaviors or our belief system or our idea that we have to be vegetarian to be a moral person. That's a very profound thing to confront. So instead of confront that, we want to look for workarounds. And then what we're doing is ignoring a real problem.
Thank you so much, Sally, for sharing that. Sally, next question is how to remove oxalates from our body?
Well, the body knows how to do that. And if you remember trigger and maintenance, what we need to do is stay low enough in what we eat for long enough that the body will take on that removal process and clear itself out. And it's a tricky process, because if you're old like me and you've been eating these foods for such a long time, you could have a lot to get rid of. And you don't want to get rid of it all at one time, because that's like what we call acute poisoning. You have a sudden surge in release back into the bloodstream, and it overwhelms the body's ability to cope. It really messes up your electrolytes and your minerals, and it can literally put you into heart palpitations and send you to the emergency room, because it is so disruptive to mineral management in the body. It can also create kidney stones. So after you stop eating oxalate, you could get a kidney stone a year later, 6 months later, or even 2 years later, because your body is releasing so much oxalate from all that old spinach or whatever you used to eat, that it is, again, it's overwhelming the body. So I usually advise people to be very conscious if they know they've eaten a lot of these high oxalate foods, like the nuts and the spinach, for a very long time. Then they need to be careful and come down and not go all the way to zero right away, like going all the way down to full carnivore diet in the beginning. For some of us, just could make things worse. So we want to ease the body into that strong desire to get rid of these particles that are sitting around creating this serious problem for the body. The body doesn't want the particles. It wants to get it out. It will, but it needs about a 10-year period to do it. So there's this long period afterwards. Once you've created oxalate buildup in your body, there's a long period of recovery, which can be quite difficult and frustrating and can make it confusing. You can't tell if eating low oxalate is helping you or not, because you keep getting oxalate symptoms. So you think, oh, it's not the oxalate in the diet, because you go back to eating your potatoes again, and it might make you feel a little better because you've gone back to maintenance and triggering. So if you go to maintenance and triggering, you stop the clearing, and so that might temporarily lower the amount in your bloodstream because you stop the clearing process. So that's a whole nother conversation that gets really confusing. We talk a lot about that in my groups. I offer classes where you can come on fairly inexpensively and learn more about those kinds of things. There's some of that on my website too.
Thank you so much, Sally. Sally, next question is, does fermentation removes oxalate content?
Fermentation can lower oxalate. So we see that in a traditional food like poi in Hawaii. Very high oxalate food. It can reduce it 25%. it's still a really high oxalate food. uh, the interesting thing is a lot of these foods that get fermented are either really high oxalate, but most of them are low oxalate foods. Like cabbage is the classic one in Europe where the Germans and everybody makes sauerkraut. Cabbage is very low in oxalate. This the regular head cabbage is a nice low oxalate food. Fermentation, well, yeah, it's already low oxalate, so it was low oxalate either way. But fermentation really helps cabbage be more digestible by letting the bacteria pre-digest it for you. It really makes it a better food. But even then, highly fermented food are high in histamines and other things, and eating tons of bacteria is not necessarily good in high volumes. You only need little bits of it, not whole portions. In fact, it probably turns on the immune system to eat a lot of bacteria because the immune system doesn't want a lot of bacteria in the small intestine or even in the colon. The immune system is kind of controlling how many bacteria are growing there. So if you eat a lot of bacteria and they're surviving the stomach somehow, because the stomach acid is designed to kill bacteria, that could also be pro-inflammatory. So fermentation, good idea, but it's not a magic answer to things. It can reduce oxalate a little bit, but it's not meaningful because the high oxalate foods, you can't reduce it enough, and the low oxalate foods were already low oxalate anyway.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, does tamarind reduces oxalates?
Tamarind is a great seasoning. It adds a lot of pep to foods, and it's a low oxalate food. So for the amount you would normally use, it's not a concern in terms of oxalates. So it's perfectly fine to use tamarind. And tamarind, probably like lemon juice and other foods with acids in them, help the body make enough alkalinity for the urine and put out enough citrates in the urine that it helps the kidneys cope with too much oxalate in the body. So it could be a little bit helpful, just like lemon juice can be helpful and citrates are helpful and minerals are helpful, and it won't add to your oxalate load. But it's not this kind of super shield that's going to protect you from oxalate. It doesn't have any kind of Wonder Woman kind of power to save the day, but it's certainly perfectly fine to use it in your food and cooking.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, how to deal with kidney stones?
Kidney stones. Kidney stones will go away if you have enough citrate in your urine, which you can create with getting enough alkalinity going in the body. So the standard treatment for kidney stones is potassium citrate. But we take citrate molecules or citrate minerals, calcium citrate, potassium citrate, magnesium citrate. They all help with kidney stones. Lemon juice helps with kidney stones. It is possible like the tamarind and stuff could help because what it does, lemon juice, the citrate molecule turns into bicarbonate in the liver. So everything you eat goes straight to the liver. The liver processes everything and it processes citrate into bicarbonate, which helps with alkalinity. If there's enough alkalinity, the kidney cells can release more citrate, which protects the kidneys. So you can help with kidney stones by stop eating so much oxalate, getting some lemon juice, taking some citrate supplements, and drinking enough water, but you don't need 6 gallons a day, but drink enough water, get enough alkalinity going, use some lemon juice, and eat a low oxalate diet. And most people do very well and stop getting kidney stones. Some of my clients have been able to just pee out their kidney stones with no pain, and it helps the body release the kidney stones. Some of us, it takes a while when you switch your diet to a low oxalate diet, it might take a year of the kidney itself releasing, because the kidneys collect a lot of oxalate. They don't want to, but they're stuck. They're right there in they're the main feature of the body that helps you get rid of oxalate. 90% of the oxalate that comes out of your body has to come out through the kidneys. So some people, they need a while for the kidneys to finish clearing out, but you'll never really get over kidney stones if you don't include a low oxalate diet.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, before you go, would you like to issue a 7-day challenge to our subscribers?
A 7-day challenge? A 7-day challenge, there's so many places to go with this. Fundamentally, if your heart is upset by information that violates your key belief systems, the things ideas you've been hanging on to, to feel secure about your choices in your life, then your 7-day challenge is to meditate on empty mind. Like release, non attachment is a really great principle in spirituality. To be unattached to ideas that have been put in your mind and are making you unfree to accept new knowledge. I would say a 7-day challenge would learn non attachment around all your predisposed belief systems and be willing to be blessed by new information.
Thank you so much, Sally, for coming to the show and helping us to become healthy. You're awesome.
It's so great that you're having fun with this topic and you're bringing more people into awareness about oxalate. It's going to be so good for so many people. And I'm so proud of anybody who can be open to this weird topic because it is so confusing. And so I'm just grateful when one person is listening to us.
Thank you, Sally. You're awesome.
You're welcome. Hey guys, so let's make sure we all subscribe. I'm going to do it. Subscribe to BNS Goku. Is that it? Yeah. So subscribe to your channel because you're bringing out some important information that more and more of us need to hear about. And this conversation has to keep going forward.